All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be moving forward a couple decades or a century into what we call the 18th century city planning or the 1700s. So at this time period, we are about to enter the era that we call the Enlightenment, and remember that this was a time when we began to look at everything with a more humanitarian emphasis, which meant looking at things like laws, looking at things like school, how people have access to education. People began to reevaluate, should everyone have access to equal rights and equal opportunities, or should it only be for a select few? Now, it's no surprise because we are today so reaping the rewards of the Enlightenment that eventually we do get, this sense of equality in terms of education and the law and so forth. Some things are still being, evaluated today, but for the most part, these are going to be the themes that are going to be driving the 18th century. So we're going to be moving to London today. Now, London, what kind of settlement do you think London began as?
Linear?
Yes, as the caption suggests. London was around during the Roman era, so this is a Roman grid, right? So we still have our Cardo, north-south, and our Decumanus with our gates at the ends. Notice that it's a little eroded at this point. London was also known as Londinium at the time, so that is the original name of London during Roman times. And recall that these are castrum camps, right? Meaning that they're military camps. So really it's a military outpost, right? And London is like the furthest north that the Roman Empire ever gets. So if you're out here, probably not having the best time, it's a very different climate. You're going to be meeting a lot of different groups from the British Isles, and they're going to be retaliating back very heavily, meaning that you need fortifications around your Roman camp. You can't leave it without walls. Now eventually, right, Rome falls, as we've been talking about, and then we have the rise of England as a country. And at this time, we have the Tudor era, right? So that's going to be Henry VIII, the guy with the 6 wives that we talked about. And during his era, we still see the ancient wall of Londinium. And if you go back to it, you can see it's changed a little bit. We have a bit of a fortification down here, a little bit of a castle. And then that gets upgraded into the Tower of London. So the Tower of London actually goes all the way back to the Roman era. And at this point, what are we seeing out here? What are these called? Developments outside of the city wall. Yeah, so we have some faubourgs outside of London at this time. And where are most of the faubourgs located? To the west or to the east side? Yes, so this is going to be a recurring pattern in London. We're going to see that primarily the faubourgs and all of the growth goes towards the west. By the year 1700, so at the beginning of the 18th century, this is the Stuart era, so Mary Stuart, the Stuart kings, the ones that are the ones that originally sent people over to the American colonies. So keep in mind, colonization is happening at this point, and that is going to influence our city planning. All right, so we see that we've continued spreading a lot towards the west. Now, if you've ever heard about Cheapside London or East Side London, it's pretty much the area where the people who are most impoverished live, which we can see doesn't have a lot of growth at this time because when you don't have money and you don't have means to build your own house, what happens is you just start building on top of the existing buildings, right? So if you have the generation that lives in there, right, their children can build a floor on top of that existing home and so forth, or just move into the same apartment. So we get the emergence of tenements and a lot of crowded living on the east side of London. On the west side of London, however, we do have our more affluent families because this is where the royal properties are. So this is going to be Buckingham Palace in this area. We don't see its extensive gardens yet, right? But this is where it's going to be located. And so all of the people who have money and influence to build, they're going to be around the king's court, ideally, meaning that they're going to be on this western region and as far away from the east side as they can be. And at this time, we see that they're beginning to take notes from France, right? France has its French squares, which are all about glorifying the king. They have a statue of the king in the center, matching arcades, and then some kind of geometric form to them. Same thing is happening in England. We're going to be looking at 3 of them really quickly: Bloomsbury, Hanover, and King Square. And if you can't see them on the map, it's for a reason. They are very small at this time. Eventually, London turns into this by the end of the 18th century. So in 1 century, we have all of this massive growth. And notice that we have huge pockets of greenery now in the west side. And that by now, the little ones that we introduced on this last slide are pretty much invisible at this point, which goes to show the scale that these squares have grown to. So an early example, Bloomsbury Square, 1660s. Again, this is the same time that Louis XIV is doing his own stuff in France. But we do see a couple differences with the English square. Number one, it is developed by a developer, right? This is not attached to the crown in any way, meaning we do not have a royal architect on board. And when we don't have a royal architect, we also don't have uniformity in facades. So the developer is going to be in charge of carving out the square, and then you're going to have individual tenants. So it could be usually courtiers, dukes, counts, viscounts, etc., are going to buy a plot of land around that square, and they could buy 2 or 3 in the case of the White House right here, unite them and have a nice big city home. Now the result of that is, of course, they each want to be better than the last, so we're not going to have matching facades at all. And the same thing is true for Hanover Square in 1720. So even when we enter the 18th century in the early part, we are still having this lack of uniformity. Right, so notice that this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks around it. This one is an oval, so we still have a geometric shape of sorts, but no matching facades, and also no statue of the king, because once again, these are not led by any royal commission. These are individual proprietors and developments. And last example of this, King Square, which is today called Soho Square. Similar thing, right? Geometric cutout, but no matching facades, no statue of the king. These are all private developments. So this is where, for the 1600s, right, prior to the 18th century, we are going to have our courtiers living. So, just a little bit of a summary. Early squares, shape geometric, like France, that's not going to change. The aesthetic, though, is different. They are not going to have matching facades. They are going to be competing with each other, meaning some might be neoclassical, some might be in a Stuart medieval type of style, and so forth. Location, wealthy areas that are going to be closer to the court, meaning the west side of London. Function, purely residential. So whereas the French squares at least had the arcading on the bottom floor for some shops and for merchants, in London, we see that these don't have any type of accommodations for merchants or any type of business. They are only for residential use. And lastly, our demographic is going to only be high-class courtiers. So this is, again, prior to the 18th century. Once we enter the 18th century, we have these changes. So the shape is still geometric, but they do get much larger, to the point where we can see them on that map. Why are they larger? Because we need more homes, because of our demographic. The aesthetic is going to begin to change. We are now going to have unified styles, because they are still going to be private developments, but the developers get smart and they realize that they have a lot more to gain by developing the entirety of the square, not just the square plaza portion, but also the homes around it. And so, in order to charge a higher rent, they do a really nice facade, matching all the way around. And that way, they can rent higher prices and make more income. The location, still the wealthy areas, but we're going to see we have a couple developments closer to the city center, because at this point, our demographic shifts. So it's no longer just the upper class, but it's also our emerging middle class. I told you the colonies are beginning to pick up at this point, and who is profiting off of this? Our merchants, right? They are the middlemen. They are the ones that bring in the sugar from the plantations, and then they give it over to the manufacturing factories in England. And so those people become wealthy, and they're not nobility, but they're also not, the lowest of the pyramid, right? They're not peasants. So they have a certain level of wealth, but no influence. And these squares are gonna be the perfect places for them to live in because they're beautiful, they give them a little bit of status, but they are still perfectly affordable and allow them to live in the city to conduct their business. And lastly, our function. Some will remain residential, but we're also gonna see the development of mixed-use buildings at this time. So as far as our urban fabric goes, we're gonna see larger cutouts inside of it, and we're also going to see that we have mixed-use buildings, specifically close to the waterfronts. Now, where this begins is actually not London. It's going to be a city called Bath. Now, Bath is also a Roman town. So putting two and two together, why do you think that a town that was founded by the Romans is called Bath? Yes?
Had a bath house?
Yeah, it had a Roman bath. So the town of Bath is later named that by the English because there was a bath there that was put in by the Romans. Again, remember, these are military camps. And let's just say that it's not the most desirable place to be, right? If you're a soldier that joins the Roman army, you're probably going to want to be at least on the Italian peninsula where you're going to have more action happening. You're going to be closer to home. You don't necessarily want to be all the way up north where it's cold and you don't really know anyone. So, in order to appease the soldiers, they built a bath, which recall is a luxury. It's a way to appease the people. So the emperor knows people are not happy up here. He gives them this, right, and it pacifies them. Now, when the English later take over this area, right, or rediscover these ruins, they're fascinated by the idea of these Roman baths. So we can see we have our original grid right here, more or less, and then we see that we have some rounded walls, which is a medieval development, and then we begin to spread out and radiate, so it turns into a bit of a radial city. This is what it looks like at the time, so it's still a very small town, but for our merchants, this is a very attractive city because this is sort of their vacation home, right? So compared to the truly wealthy people who have big estates of their own and they don't have to go to some random town to go vacation, middle-class people cannot afford to just go out into the middle of the countryside and make a development out of nowhere, right? They still rely on having certain connections, access to food, a church, society, and so forth. So what the middle class does is they choose vacation towns outside of London, and Bath is one of them. Now, like I said, the discovery of these Roman baths is fascinating to the British, to the point where they start doing some really strange rituals and things relating to the baths. So we know originally, right, the Romans are actually going to be bathing. This is going to be their frigidarium. If you recall, that's the normal room temperature water. Out here, just a normal swimming pool. We have our caldarium, which is going to be the hot water that is lit from below. So this is the first step, and then you eventually get to the frigidarium. But for whatever reason, when the British discovered it and they decided to start using it, they felt that the best way to make use of it was by drinking the water, which is really nasty at this point, right? This infrastructure has not been cleaned since Roman times, and then the plumbing they're using is going to be made out of lead. So not only is it nasty, it's also toxic for them. But it was believed that this water had magical health benefits. So people went to Bath to vacation to improve their health by drinking water with lead. Now, because the water is so disgusting, people would get a cup of it and they couldn't drink it all in one go. So what they had to do was they sat around these large assembly rooms, size of the one we're in. They sat around tables, had discussions, talked about things, and just sipped on it very, very little. So it took about an hour, 2 or 3 hours to finally drink the whole cup of lead water. But of course, this fosters the need for society, right? You're not going to be drinking the water standing around. You need places to drink the water and places to go after you drink this water. And so what they decide to do is develop 3 separate areas in Bath, and all of these become residential squares for our middle class. So after you're done drinking your nasty water, you can now go live in one of these, right? Has anyone here watched Bridgerton? Okay. So you know how in Bridgerton, they're always inviting the ladies out to go promenade and go on a walk, and that's how they court them. So that is what goes on in these squares. From one square to the other, we develop the streets and make them look pretty so that you can promenade up and down them in a safe way. And then of course we have this big lawn, which is where you would have picnics and the games that the court would play, or that the middle class would play in this case. Notice that they're all connected though. So this is the biggest development of the 18th century as far as urban planning goes, because the 16th century we had squares, but in the 18th century we are now connecting those squares. So connectivity through the city is going to become a priority during this century because it is becoming safer, because you want to walk, you want to promenade and socialize throughout the city, not just locked up in a little house in a square. So we're going to start with the Queen's Square, move into the Circus, and then end with the Royal Crescent. This is what the Queen's Square looks like. We can see it's still very geometric, nice open area, which is a luxury at this time period. But notice that all of our facades on the four sides are matching, not just the side, but amongst the four sides. So as you stand in the center, you have this really beautiful square with uniform facades all the way around. Right, and this is an example of where you would promenade if you are in the upper middle class. Notice that the women are walking on their own with the children because this is now considered a safe space for them to do so. What archetype are we copying on this facade? Yes, we're copying the French palace. So we're seeing how we're taking the grandness and the royalty of the Louvre, and we are placing it on the facade of a residential square. But notice you can still read the individual units. So we know that the center one is a house, this is another one, another one, another one. So we can still read that we have individual townhomes, but as a whole, they read much more dignified language than what we're seeing in London at the time. The next step here is going to be the Circus, and notice how the street comes into the Circus and all those townhomes are uniform. So you never break this illusion that you're walking through a beautiful, picturesque city. So it's kind of similar to what's going on in Rome with the concept of the theater, right? We have a beautiful front, and then the backstage is just kind of left to do whatever it wants, where we see the lack of uniformity back here. Now the Circus is going to be based on another archetype that we've seen. So take into account it is round, and then also take into account the orders we see. We see Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. What ancient archetype is round and has those three orders stacked one over the other? Yeah, so we're now referencing the Colosseum, and that's why it's called a circus, right? Because it's a circle. That's what they called circuses before we named circuses what we know them as today. So we're seeing how now they are borrowing some nice classical language from Rome in order to give this a nicer facade, right? They can't put a palace facade on it because it's kind of an infinite circle. So instead they choose an archetype that's already a circle and just turn it inside out. So now you're inside the Colosseum looking out rather than out looking in. And the last step is going to be the Royal Crescent. So this is the broadest of them all. You can begin to read the individual townhomes, and if you look really closely, we do have the doors, which are the only thing that tells us that there are regulated bays here. Now notice that although this is a very large colossal colonnade, rusticated base, we don't have a central pavilion like the French archetype would tell us to do. Why do you guys think that is? Functionally, logically, why would we not want a central pavilion on a curve? Yes?
Would disrupt the traffic.
It could disrupt the traffic, yes. And it would have to disrupt the traffic because it would have to protrude out. Because if you think of it, if you have a curve and you have a pavilion stick out, by the time you get to the innermost part of that curve where the pavilion is, it's just going to jam into the facade. So you would have to project it a whole lot more, which, remember, French palaces do not project forward. That is what Germanic palaces do. And so the designer decides to omit that detail altogether, give a little bit more emphasis to these ends over here by giving them nice pediment entrances. But we leave the uniformity, and it is this large colonnade that ultimately gives this a sense of regality, right? We don't need the pediment in order to do so. So here we're borrowing, again, colossal colonnade, in this case a Corinthian Ionic blend over here. which tells us that they're not necessarily following academically correct neoclassicism just yet, but that they're beginning to understand a little bit more about the rules and the proportions that go with classical systems. So now that they've experimented and they've seen what Bath could look like, they are now bringing back these ideas to London and trying to apply them there. They want to have the same lifestyle, the same beautiful squares that connect one to the other, and the same security for the ladies to promenade from one square to the other without having to worry about being attacked and abducted on the streets. So we have a large series of developments at this time, and we can see all these green squares are from the 18th century. Today we're going to be looking at Bedford Square, the Regent Street development, and then the Adelphi Terrace. 3 different types of developments that I think envelop what the 18th century is quite well. So let's start with Bedford Street development, or Bedford Square. So the actual Bedford Square is going to be the one up there, but it's actually a larger development than just a square. It spans a whole couple of blocks, and what Bedford Square does that is unique and different is that we do have a single developer in charge of the whole thing, including those facades. So this is the first time that we see in London a square that has the same aesthetic all throughout. And once again, we see that they are borrowing notes from the Louvre, right? We have our central pavilion, sort of a colossal colonnade and a rusticated base, more or less. But when we look at it in person, right, at the actual photographs, you can see that this is nowhere near as fancy as what we saw in Bath, and there are several clues that tell us so. First of all, we don't have columns on the brownstone townhomes, right? We only really have them in the center, and even in the center, they're just plastered on, right? They're pilasters. They're not actual 3D columns, much less on these other ones. So if we remove the white central pavilion, right, we completely lose the idea that this is following a French palace archetype, and instead it just kind of looks like a regular brick home. And that's going to be our second clue, that they're using brick instead of stone. Brick is a lot easier to source than large blocks of stone, so it's going to be a cheaper type of development. And then we see that the entrances here are using this sort of striped motif in order to give it a little bit more interest on the facade. Because again, you don't really have that. It just kind of looks like a standard normal building like any other one. And we want to charge higher rents. So the more beautiful and special we make each one of these, the better tenants we can get. Now notice that they did begin to add individual touches to each one of these, right? Some people decided to add balconies. So we have that concept of the noble floor on top with a nice balcony to look out onto the square develop. And we can see they even get quite fancy with this one over here. So although it is a private development, we now see that the individual owners of these townhomes are beginning to add a little bit of personality to them. So there is much less regulation in the English square compared to the French square, right? If you're a courtier in France and you try to do this, you're going to be out of the king's court because it's a sign of disrespect to him. But in London, you can do this. The next type of development is the Adelphi Terrace. So this is not going to be a square, but it is going to be a mixed-use type of development, and it's going to be one of the first that we see of its kind. The Adelphi Terrace is known for 4 reasons. First, it's the first embankment of the River Thames, meaning that it's the first time that we don't have a natural riverbed, which I'll show you in a second. Secondly, it's our first mixed-use development in London. Third, it is privately funded by the architect, who is the developer in this case, which causes a couple of problems. And lastly, it's the first time we have the idea of the river as not a disgusting, but a picturesque scene that we want to take advantage of. So at this time, London's main river, the Thames, is really gross, right? Sewage isn't really a concept that they have fully developed, meaning that they just throw it straight into the river. If you're collecting trash, if you're collecting, horse feces off the street, you just throw them into the river. The river is the solution for everything. So this thing is absolutely gross. It smells really bad, especially in the summers, and it also causes a lot of diseases. There is this cartoon, I did not add it, but I'll just look it up to show it to you guys. It's called Father Thames Presenting His Children to the Fair City of London. So here he is. So Father Thames being the depiction of the river, you can see it looks very raggedy. This is the fair city of London depicted by a woman. And then we see the Father Thames's children, who are diphtheria, cholera, and typhus, right? So the cartoon is literally telling us that that is what the river has to offer to the fair city: disease and really bad smells. So at the time, it wasn't looked favorably upon, and people didn't really want to go near the river because it wasn't really a nice place to be. But the Adelphi Terrace completely changes the idea of what the river could be and makes it into a beautiful, picturesque scene. So now people are beginning to rethink, well, maybe I should develop by the river and have a really great view and then make more money with that view. The Adelphi Terrace does get its influence from a palace all the way down in Croatia, which goes to show at this point we're having more academic revivalism happening. This is Diocletian's palace, one of the last emperors of Rome, the one that specifically persecuted the Christians really heavily. And the Adams brothers study it intently. They create a reconstruction and they begin to create different versions of it in a more modern way. So we see that we have some kind of base down here where the river is going to come up against, and we know that this base is probably going to be utilitarian. And then we have the more livable areas up on top, and this is something that they are going to put into the Adelphi Terrace. So this is what the terrace ends up looking like, where we have a really nice colonnade down at the bottom, and notice that it's kind of like a loggia, right? And loggias are associated with business. So we know we have some kind of business endeavors going down at the bottom. And then on top, notice we have a railing, is going to be our more livable, dignified areas, where you're also going to have more white-collar professions. So lawyers, clerks, architects, they're going to rent offices on those upper portions. How does the Adelphi Terrace work? Well, now that the river is embanked, which we can see right here, right, rather than having a shallow riverbed that naturally progresses into the river, what we do is we build into the river and then straight down. And so what that does is it gives us depth right here, meaning that we can have larger vessels, such as this one, come up right next to that embankment, drop off their cargo, carriages pick it up and take it elsewhere, or carriages take it into the loggia area where they store it, because the bottom level of the Adelphi Terrace is going to be warehouses. The upper levels, notice, are quite detached, and they're very high up. So compared to these developments, where if you're going to go up to the river, you're going to be right on the riverbed, on the Adelphi Terrace, there is a level of separation. So you don't necessarily get the smell of the water, you're not necessarily where all the utilitarian stuff is, and you have an elevated view of the rest of the city's skyline, including St. Paul's back here, which we looked at last semester. In section, this is how the Adelphi works. So cargo comes off here. All the F are going to be warehouses where you can store things. You can keep horses in there if you want to. So if you're a merchant and you trade textiles, you can keep your textiles in F. Notice that we have streets running underneath A. So A is regular city level, B is going to be underground. So now we can have the carriages come through here, pick up the cargo and take it elsewhere, rather than congesting Street A. And now Street A is a nice place for our middle class residents to walk down without having to run into disgusting things or unsightly things like people working. As you're standing on the terrace, notice what kind of people we have up here, right? We have ladies wearing really big gowns that would get otherwise really disgusting down on the riverbank. So now they're able to come up close to the river, once again, completely detached from the reality of what the river is, because they can't smell it. They don't see what's going on underneath them, all of the people that are working, and they get this really great panorama. So other people start taking notes. They realize that people are really into this concept of dining and walking past a riverbed, and they start doing the same thing. Now the facades of the Adelphi Terrace are going to begin to take notes from Gibbs, from neoclassical revivals. We want to create a nice, dignified place up on top. So we have a bit of residential, and then we also have some offices. So now we see the development of the first true mixed use, right? We have at the bottom more, blue collar utility type of work. On the upper levels, more white collar service type of work. And then on the uppermost levels, we have residences, which is kind of how our mixed use developments continue to be to this day. So the concept that you can work and live in the same development also develops at this time. This is what our facades look like. Notice they're still brick. right? Which tells us they're trying to make them somewhat affordable. And then we're giving them these pilasters to make them look a little bit nicer and give them more emphasis. But notice that it's just kind of plastered on. This is not stone. And then notice that the pilasters aren't actually a correct order. So we know that they're probably taking notes from Gibbs's book. Now I'm going to show you what the Adelphi Terrace looks like today so we can see how the urban fabric has further developed since then. So this right here, this block, is where the Adelphi Terrace used to be. It was demolished for the most part. But this is where it used to be. Now recall that the Adelphi Terrace was right up to where the river was. And what do we see in its place today? We see a park, right? So what does that tell us about how the attitude towards the river changed later down the road? Why would we want to park next to the river, at the river's level?
Because it's not like picturesque.
Yes, because now it's considered beautiful, and by the time they develop it, sewage has been invented, meaning the river isn't as gross. And actually, as of 2012, I believe the Thames is the cleanest river that runs through a metropolis. So they do have a pretty good system of sanitation. But we see that the Adelphi Terrace pretty much becomes obsolete as a warehouse because it no longer has that riverfront development. And so they tear it down and they rebuild this instead. So it's an office building where we can see the concept of the terrace is still there, right? So we see street level A still runs on top over here. And then we see what would have been those lower levels with the F warehouses down here, or today the parking garage of this development. And then all that remains is going to be this little facade down here, which is the one that I showed you guys. This is all we have remaining of the Adelphi Terrace by the Adams brothers. Now I told you this was developed by an architect, which is special, right? It's the first time someone of our profession actually develops a whole development and gets to sell it, but it is also problematic because at this time it was seen as being a bias, right? It was seen as the architect selling something that he himself designed, so obviously he's going to speak highly of it, and he can even be lying to you, and it's actually not all that great, which that's not really how it works, right? The architect is of course going to be the most interested in creating a beautiful development, but at the time it was unheard of for architects to be developers, something that's changed a lot to this day. When we talk about the history of the profession in a couple weeks, I think you'll see how rigid our profession used to be back in the day to how semi-flexible it's become in the present. So that's when they began demolishing the Adelphi Terrace, and we can see those streets underground in true section down here, and where the warehouse units would have been underneath the whole development. And then they just built up that office building with the parking lot right where it is. And lastly, we have Regent Street development. So this one is going to be absolutely enormous. As the name suggests, it's not just a square or two or three. It is going to be an entire street that is developed in 18th century fashion, which once again, the biggest thing that happened in the 18th century is that we have interconnected spaces in the city. So, Regent Street is developed by the regent. Do you guys remember what a regent was? When we talked about the Sforza family, remember that Ludovico was the regent who somehow made his nephew mysteriously disappear. So what is a regent?
The person in charge?
The person in charge who does not have the crown. So at this time, we do have George III, right? So again, if you do watch Bridgerton, you know how the king is labeled as crazy in the show. We don't really know exactly what condition the king had to this day, but we do know that he wasn't fully there. So because of that, we can't necessarily have the king be in charge, but we also can't necessarily take the crown away because that would look really bad. Imagine what people would think if they knew their monarch was not right in the head, right? They would want to remove the line and give it to another family because at this time, people believed that you could inherit things like that. So what they did instead was they had the king's firstborn son, the Prince Regent, take over without fully having the crown yet, which is kind of the best of both worlds, right? You get to make certain decisions, you are in power, but at the same time, you don't have to adhere to living in the castle and following all the royal protocol. So he's able to do other things, which we'll look at. Actually, we won't look at. My other class will look at. Do you guys remember when we talked about exoticism last semester? Do you guys remember the Royal Pavilion at Brighton? Right, for those who don't, I will show you really quickly. So this is the building. Recall it's an example of exoticism, and then remember the rooms were designed to look like Chinese stuff or chinoiserie, which we saw last class. So this was the Prince Regent's Pleasure Palace, which he had out in Brighton, which is a beach town, which shows us the degree of liberty that he has at the time. So though he gets to make big decisions, he also gets to go on retreats like these because he doesn't have the weight of the crown on him officially yet. So while he's in London, the Regent decides to have this big development, which we call Regent Street. And in order for this to happen, because it is such a large project, we need 4 things to come together, including we need a project leader that has to be well connected and has to be energetic. They have to be well connected so that they can get the Act of Parliament passed, right? So if you're well connected, you're gonna be friends with the people in Parliament, which are gonna be your lords, your barons, your dukes, viscounts, and so forth. You can ask them for the favor to vote for Regent Street development, and you need them to be energetic because this is a very heavy project. It's gonna take decades to do. You're gonna get tired of it. You need someone who can fully, carry the weight of this project on their shoulders. Number 2, we need a good route. We need it to go through all the right places, right? We can't have this going through Cheapside or East Side London because then people won't use it. It has to be somewhere in the west side of London, and it has to go through desirable areas that people already go to. We need that Act of Parliament in order for it to become a law that this will happen so that we can tear down everything in its way. And we need £1 million. So that's how much it costs to make a development like this back in that time. So to give you a size or a sense of scale, the park that we are leading to is up here. This entire yellow street you see here, all the way down to this green space is going to be the entirety of the development of Regent Street. So it is immensely large, and again, notice the location. It's on the west side where we have the royal properties. So everything that you see in the black, which perfectly lines that street, and then the regions around that park is what the Regent development is. So once again, that concept of theatry and creating theater fronts for people to walk down is prevalent in London as well. So I'm gonna walk you through it. So just try to stick to it because it's a really long development and we're going to be looking at the whole entirety of it. So we're going to start down here. Let's take the labels off. So down here is Buckingham Palace, right? This is where the royal family lives to this day. Regent Street starts right here. Notice we have a little bit of like a mini trivium sort of leading into it. And this is where it officially starts. This is what we call Waterloo Place. Does anyone want to guess why it's called Waterloo Place? Why are the British so obsessed with Waterloo? So that's where Napoleon was defeated, all right? And the British are very proud about that. Battle of Waterloo is where they defeat him, they take out the big tyrant Napoleon, and so the British are going to have lots of different developments to celebrate that fact, including this one right next to Buckingham Palace. Now notice how the street opens up just a little bit to create a sense of a square inside the street itself. Okay, so once again, this is what it looks like, and notice those corners are turned in. So where you could have very easily just run the street all the way down and had the facades remain the same width, they decided to open it up instead. So now we're creating a sense of place within the street itself. The next thing on that street is Piccadilly Circus. Now Piccadilly Circus is going to be a circus like the one in Bath, which means it's going to be an inside-out circle, but because it is so heavily transited, it does get distorted over time. So this is what Piccadilly Circus looks like today, right? We continue going down that street, and we reach this little junction here. Notice that it's a crossroads of many different roads, but also we have 3 subterranean routes underneath this. So at this time, we're developing the concept of trains and public infrastructure underground, and so lots of stuff goes on here. So eventually, our clean little circus turns into this. But Regent Street develops this way, right? So we have these sort of cues as we go along the way to tell us where we should continue going. We have this right here, which if you notice, creates a nice focal point as you come down the street. And as you get closer to it, you know, I need to go this way to continue down Regent Street. So this is why we need a well-planned out route, because you're gonna have things in the way like Piccadilly Circus that are not gonna allow you to go straight, and you have to make choices. Which way are we gonna deviate it in order to make this work? There is Piccadilly Circus today, entrance to the subterranean. And then we have this section of development here. So now we're gonna move on to this area of Regent Street. Notice the facades are completely uniform all the way down, right? They are in the neoclassical mode. And like the Royal Crescents, they do not have central pavilions, right? We are not necessarily following the exact French Louvre model, but we are giving it some dignity by giving it a nice sort of neoclassical facade, right? But we don't fully have the colonnade there. So we do have more uniformity now in our streets. Now notice that as you get into the the crescent of Regent Street, we do have this street that runs through it right here, right? Meaning that you should have theoretically broken up this facade here, but what they did is they ran the facade all the way through, and they just created an opening for that street to cross it. So now we're setting a sense of hierarchy, and we're going Regent Street is the most important avenue, so that has to take priority, and we will mark it as such. We don't want to break this theatrical illusion that this is a continuous, beautiful street. And so they hide the streets behind it by creating this kind of pavilion structure over it. We continue down Regent Street, right? And then for a while, we have these developments. Each of them is going to be privately developed, but each of the developers is going to have a sense of what they want it to look like. So each block is going to be more or less uniform. So notice this one right here is all one big development. This one right here is all one big development. So it gives us a sense of variety as we go down the street. And with variety comes variety in class. So now we have the upper class. If they want to live on here, they can do so because there's some really nice developments. We have our middle class who can live here because now we have affordable spaces. And if you're lower middle class, there are a couple of developments which maybe are not as fancy, but are at least on Regent Street. You're in the right area to make the right connections. So then we reach this little piece right here called Oxford Circle. Notice that we are emphasizing that it is a circle or a circus by having all the facades match up on the four corners. And then, I'm just gonna travel a little bit more, we reach this. This is gonna be All Souls Church, and this was here before Regent Street was actually developed. Now, what do you notice about the relationship of All Souls Church and the street?
It serves as a focal point?
It does serve as a focal point, yes. So, originally, All Souls Church did not look that way. The original All Souls Church was just this box. Remember, London at this time is Protestant, meaning that their churches are preaching boxes. Very simple. Now, because the street is going to run towards it, they decided, let's add a portico so that it becomes a nice focal point at the end of that street. And they further decided to make that portico round, right, to play with the curvature of the street and pick people up as they're walking down the street. So, if we go back to map and how it is aligned in relation to the city, notice how the front portico of that church doesn't really match the back portion, but it does a great job of intercepting pedestrians as they're walking down the street. They could have very easily left a flat facade there, but it simply would not have looked as aesthetic as you're coming up the street, and it also wouldn't have been as inviting. You would not be as curious to go into it if that wasn't there. The other thing we have happen on this junction is we have this big square right here that was there before Regent Street development. Now this is a mansion. It is a city mansion that belongs to a duke with a lot of power, the Duke of Portland. So that's where the name Portland comes from. So the Duke of Portland goes up to the developer of Regent Street and he says, absolutely not, you are not gonna demolish my palazzo or palace in the city to run this street through. So what they do instead is they decide to deviate it through the mansion and this All Souls Church, and they create this nice windy road here. So that is how you begin to talk with people in Parliament. So now Duke of Portland is happy because he gets the benefit that now his house has this great view all the way down to Regent's Park. So he has a beautiful framed view. It's not going to demolish his home, so he's going to vote for the development of Regent Street. And that's why you need a well-connected project leader, so he can talk to his friends and convince them that this is good for them. As we continue down this road, notice that we begin to have the greenery infiltrated. So we're getting hints that we're getting close to something big, which is the park. At this point, we are entering the developments that we call Portland Place, again named after the Duke of Portland. So he is going to be a developer, and he says, I want in on that project because he knows there's a lot of money to be made out of it with rent. And these are the facades that he decides to go for. Notice we do have end pavilions, central pavilions, sort of a colossal colonnade rusticated base. He is also going to be borrowing from the Louvre and the Palace facade in France. Not too much of it is left today, right? A lot of this has been redeveloped, including this piece here. But notice that even this modern building decided to keep a bit of a neoclassical facade to continue matching the idea of what Regent Street is. This side didn't do such a great job, but this one at least attempted it. So we can see this one down here, even though it has scaffolding, we can sort of see a temple front on it, pavilions, and we can see that it's 5 different developments. So now we can have 5 middle-class families move in, and though they're not perfectly, matchy to each other, they at least have this central pediment to make it look a little bit nicer. The materials, however, give us away, right? We know that this isn't going to be super upper class because it's made out of brick. Continue down, right? You can see we have more and more developments. All of these were formerly a part of the Duke of Portland's property. And eventually we reach this opening. And these are going to be called the terraces, which are the opening into the park itself. Now the terraces, you'll notice, are for the upper class. So this is what they look like. They are all completely unified facades. We have actual 3D columns, not just pilasters that are plastered onto brick. We're using the color white, which is always seen as more proper than brick or just regular stone. And as you continue down the park, we have these beautiful terraces, which have this upper promenade for walking. Because the park is actually dirt down here. So if you have a nice big dress, you don't want to walk down here necessarily. You want to walk on this beautiful paved terrace up here. And just by looking at the facade, we already understand that this is not for lower middle class. Right, so as we move down, right, we can continue around the park, continue chasing those developments, and we can see it begins to get nicer and nicer and nicer as we get further into it. Because again, it's a luxury to be able to live far from the center because you have carriages, you have people that can do things for you. You don't have to walk everywhere. So you can live all the way up here in front of the park and have this super nice terrace, right? And notice that there are individual townhomes inside of it. And not have to worry about the proximity to your resources. All right, so that's it for today's lecture, pretty short. We do have 15 minutes left, so I did want to talk about a couple of things. First, I do have a couple announcements. We have a mayor's symposium on February 28th. If you're not familiar with Eric Strain, he's probably like the best architect in Nevada, the best example of a good desert architect. So he's going to be hosting it along with the mayor, where they're going to be having a couple of different talks on what the idea of a museum means. Recall last semester we talked about what museums symbolize, the styles that are chosen for them. So you guys are already pretty well primed on the history of the museum. The symposium is just going to talk about it a little bit more, and we're going to be looking at what the museum for Las Vegas could look like. If you don't already know, we are going to be getting an art museum. There are some renderings out already if you want to look them up, but that's what the symposium is going to be about. Number 2, we are going to have First Friday on March 7th, so some of your artwork will be on display from your city collages. I don't know which ones yet, since we haven't seen any, but some of them will be up. Number 3, Women in Building. This was changed from March 7th to March 28th. Yes?
It's called Women Building Nevada now.
Okay. Okay, Women Building Nevada is going to be on March 28th. So if you do want to participate in that, you have to email Deborah Oakley, so deborah.oakley@unlv.edu. All the information is on the UNLV School of Architecture social media. It is first come, first serve, and it's open to anyone, right? So it's not just for women. If you want to go there and you're a guy, that is perfectly fine as well. It's more so to build up communication skills, leadership skills, so it's something that could apply to anyone. Just make sure that if you want to come, you let her know immediately, so you're first on the list. And lastly, Duck Duck Shed, which I talked to you about on the first day of school. I told you it was going to be 24 through 27. I have a couple more details now. So we are going to be doing a bit of a competition amongst you guys that is going to have some kind of monetary prize attached to it. So for your collage on Las Vegas that you guys are going to do after we come back from spring break, you are going to be using them to enter into the Duck Duck Shed competition. If you don't want to enter, that's fine, but you're going to do it anyway, so you might as well. We're going to have 80 submissions from you guys. It is also going to be open to my 4th years, so you're going to be competing against 4th years as well, meaning it's going to be around 110 submissions, more or less. From there, it's going to be narrowed down in a preliminary round to around 25 best, and then there's going to be a jury comprised of the curator of the Neon Museum, local architect Eric Strain, AIA chapter leader Alexia, and then probably someone else that I have yet to select and reach out to, and they're going to be the ones selecting whoever wins the competition. So make sure that you really, hone your collage skills, which speaking of, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was your collages are going to be due 2 weeks from this week on the 25th. So you still have about a week and a half to work on it. If you have any preliminary compositions that you want to work through, I am happy to help you do that and tell you how you can improve it. But in order to do that, you do have to have most of it done by then, just not glued down. We can talk about some ideas on how to compose it. Your bibliographies should be done by this point. If they are not, you shouldn't get on that immediately. Your assessment is also going to be on that day, and that's also what I wanted to talk to you guys about. Because there are 80 of you in this class, that is a lot of grading to make you guys write. So what we're going to do instead is a multiple choice. We're going to be doing a multiple choice test, and I'm going to give you all the questions ahead of time. They're going to be very easy, just like the ones on your quiz. I will be giving that to you sometime early next week. So it's going to be somewhere around like 60 questions that you'll have to know, but it'll be pretty easy. So I'll open my working document just to give you an idea of the types of questions. But again, it's not done yet. Still have to add a couple things to it. And then on the actual exam, it'll just have like 30 questions, more or less. So you guys just have to bring in a Scantron, that way I can grade it as fast as possible for you guys, and I can focus on actually looking at your collages and not looking over a bunch of writing. The rest of your assessments, I'm not sure what they're gonna look like yet, but we'll get there when we get there. Does anyone have any questions on the project or the collage so far? Yes.
For collecting materials, do you have any suggested methods, just places to go, things to look for, or instead of just Google searching?
Yes.
That's been my biggest challenge.
Yes. So when you look for materials, you're mostly going to be getting them off the internet and printing them. That's mostly what you're going to be doing. But the places where you can get them are Art Store. And Art Store is great because it gives you older historical images, like these, that you wouldn't be able to easily find on somewhere like Google. So what city do you have?
Seattle.
So if you just look up Seattle randomly, right, you begin to get things like these plans, sections, things that relate to Seattle. And you can begin to take those and think about how you want to formulate and frame them. So this, for example, looks like a manhole cover, and that could be a reference to the infrastructure of Seattle and how they deal with their water. And you would just trim out the circle and somehow place it on your collage somehow, right? That could be a good way to do it. And also take a couple of these sections if you wanted to. It looks like they're really focusing on that public library. But you can begin to, it looks like we have an old Denny district, so I would look into whatever that is and possibly print out this. The great thing about these is that because they're old images, they already have a lot of grain on them, which means you don't really have to alter them all that much in order to make them look nice and varied as far as texture goes. All right, so this is what the questions are going to be looking like. This is a work in progress. So it'll be questions like, what's the most important structure in a medieval city? What are the defining characteristics of a radial city? And they're all in order in the PowerPoint. So they're broken down by lecture. If you open up that PowerPoint, you'll be able to answer them in order as you go through the slides. So you'll have it for about a week and a half. So I suggest that you go through all of it, answer all of them. And if you have any questions, we will answer them next Thursday. Okay. Does that seem fair to everyone? Okay. Yeah, this unit is very just kind of factual, so I don't really want to make you write a whole bunch of analysis paragraphs, but we might do that for some other units. Any questions on this assessment? Okay. All right, so if there's no questions on that, does anyone have questions on the quiz for today that you feel, yes?
What was the actual